We're back. We
Three of us are back.
We took a break last week. We had a hiatus. Now we're back, except for Kurt.
So does my voice sound different? You know, I had nasal surgery last week. And so, by the way, 27 tampons shoved up each nostril is not fun, but was not as painful as I thought. But I was really worried that my podcasting career was over because my voice had changed. My dad says I sound different.
I sat over here for a reason. You know, we had that back and forth about Colin's reach, and he reminded us of his 8 factor.
There we go.
So I sat over here in Kirk's spot thinking Colin would be in his normal spot. But
okay.
And then I moved over here by you.
Yeah. I'll watch my P's and Q's as they say.
Exactly. Yeah, you've already got one side of your lip bruised there. We don't need to get the other.
That's a pending Darwin Award submission. And yes, it was.
So
did we get video of it?
Well, I have to see if I can recover it off the phone that was essentially destroyed but still operating. I just can't. I have to temporarily replace the screen to see if that video is captured. And also the
I hope that's coming.
Sounds like it was a violent event.
It'll never see the light of day. The audio will probably be even better.
All right, let's roll into energy news because we've been out of it for 2 weeks. So
acquired Diamond Offshore this morning for $1.6 billion.
Oh, that happened this morning. I didn't see that.
Happened this morning.
Cash and stock. And I think 11 and change percent premium over Friday's close. Noble gets essentially the centerpiece assets or their 7th gen drill ships. They've got some other assets that they noted, but if your customers are going to consolidate, I guess it makes sense. $100 million in synergies in the first year is what was in their release and Noble's release that I saw. I wasn't aware of it until you mentioned it earlier.
This is the first M&A and offshore drillers in a while. There was some in like 2016, 17 timeframe, but it's been kind of quiet since then, unless I'm missing any. But it's a pretty big deal. I'm looking at it right now. I missed this. I had no idea this happened.
Circa, let's call it 98, 99. I put together a big pitch book that said there should be only one offshore E&P company, at least on the shelf. And then there should only be one offshore service provider. And I wrote up these big diagrams about how everybody could contribute all their assets to this and what share they would get. And I ran around to the industry and pitched to everybody, and everybody said, that sounds great. I'm willing to run it. And 2, my share needs to be twice as big. So I got that at every stop. I wonder if...
Then Chuck, you were the consolidator maxi.
Yeah, I was consolidator maxi. I wonder if this was actually the opposite. If those guys were sitting there, no, you run it. No, you run it. I don't want to be around.
Yeah, so
anymore.
Noble acquired Pacific Drilling in 2021. I think that was probably the last one.
Last meaningful one, yeah.
Yeah, that I remember. So Noble's kind of becoming the giant there, swallowing everyone up. So who do we have left? We got Noble, Transocean, Seadrill. Who else is out there? Maybe it for
I was never an offshore guy.
Drill ships, but yeah. Diamond's office is right over here off of I-10, right before our office. Wonder if they keep that or where's Noble?
We're looking for space.
Yeah, we'll take that. We'll take their space.
Does that coincide with the Digital Wildcatters IPO on the Texas Exchange?
Yeah. I think they said first companies listed are going to be in 2026. So it gives me 2 years of runway to build up until then.
Didn't they raise, what did they raise?
$100 million bucks. Yeah. Yeah, we didn't get to talk about that last week, but Texas Stock Exchange backed by, I think it was Citadel and BlackRock. Is that right? Did you see? Let me look real quick. Let's see. Texas Stock Exchange. I'm pretty sure that's right, but I don't want to.
I would think exchanges would be a thing of the past. I think
They kind of are. Well, let's talk about that a little bit because,
yeah.
like, regional exchange, like,
I mean, we used to have regional exchanges, and they all kind of just wound up under the NASDAQ.
yeah, like, why? What's the purpose? But everyone knows what the purpose of this one is. It's for anti-ESG. So, will this be the market where you can get away with not having some of the bullshit ESG standards that
guns, alcohol,
yeah,
firearms,
I was on this,
tobacco, energy,
barbecue.
I
was on this email thread, with these really rich oil and gas guys, some of them billionaires. And they were talking before I got put on the thread, and they were talking about wanting to create a Texas Wall Street that was based in anti-ESG. And so that was back in like 2020. So this talk's been happening for
it's going to be interesting to see how the national exchanges politic around this imminent launch, I guess. Did you say 2026?
Yeah, hold on. I can never find anything when I want it. I'm looking here. Let's see if Perplexity will help me out. Yeah, it was BlackRock and Citadel that put up that $100 million, $120 million in initial funding.
I wonder if I could go be commissioner.
Maybe so.
I'll be commissioner of an exchange.
I don't know.
Give me a big old cowboy hat.
You're a private guy, though.
Oh, that's true.
I don't know who the guys are behind it, who's launching it and putting it together. But I mean, having BlackRock and Citadel putting up the money for it signals something.
It's 180 degrees from where BlackRock was at the beginning of the.
Who we got? Remember, we have that BDE episode
ESG
where I'm
movement.
bashing on Larry Fink
Yeah, exactly.
for pushing.
Although, how base can it actually be, though, if they're going to headquarter it in Dallas? I mean, I guess it could be worse if it was in Austin, but
Is that where they're headquartering?
yeah.
Says the Dallas Cowboys fan.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah, needs to be in Houston, in my opinion, but that's either here nor there. So yeah, 2026 is when they'll start listing. I think that they get licensed in 2025. So sounds like that'll happen pretty quick.
It's going to be fun.
They like what they were talking about in like the news articles was that talking about all the companies that are headquartered in Texas, and they named all these big companies. But is that actually relevant to the Texas Stock Exchange? Like, would who's a big company that's headquartered here?
Exxon.
Going blank. Yeah, Exxon.
Yeah, the biggest.
Would Exxon list on the Texas Stock Exchange over the New York Stock Exchange? Like, what's the benefit to moving over?
Yeah, they need to have something in the business plan because it doesn't feel like trading securities. You know what? Now that you say, here's the deal. Trading stocks. There's not a lot of money in that. And Mark, you should take over this conversation whenever you want because I know we've done it. But so trade. The margins on trading stocks pretty slim. Where the exchanges are making all their money is on the back end data. Who owns what, who's trading what, and they sell that. So like NASDAQ packages that up and sells it to you.
Yeah.
Hey, you want to know who's buying your stock, when, all that sort of stuff. So, potentially that's what this is can we get companies listed over here and we're going to wind up with a bunch of data.
With energy over the last several years going from a peak of around 13-14% of the S&P to a trough of under 3%. Don't know where it is exactly now, probably just under 5%. And the contraction that implies in terms of trading stocks and the price pressure, it's a pretty skinny business, skinnier today than it's ever been.
Yeah.
In terms of per share commissions, I know, some firms have actually shut down specialist trading operations or outsourcing those things because the margins on those businesses have continued to come under pressure over the last decade plus. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that You just have much more efficient mediums of trading your own book, which, we did when I was on the buy side for a while. We always looked at our our trading costs and did a lot of our own trading through a lot of these kind of online platforms, even on the institutional side. There are other ways to get paid in the energy securities business, but trading commissions have continued to shrink just in terms of both price and volume.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there could be a story of let's create an exchange for smaller companies, make it more price competitive, because it's a lot of money to be able to list on NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. So, then because the one thing you do know is the Fidelities and all these big institutions, they have way more money than they have opportunities. That's why we saw all those SPAC deals done that like we're done. And so maybe that's part of the story. I wonder if we can find a CEO or whoever's leading the charge. Come on the podcast.
Get someone to come on the show and talk about it for sure. I didn't.
All right. So from Texas, should we go to India?
Sure.
We finally had the Indian elections done. They started April 19th. They finished in early June. There were 7 different phases, and this was the election for the House of the People, the lower house of the Indian government. There are 543 members. I'm going to try this, so anyone correct me. Lok Sabha, is that the lower house?
Sounds good.
Anyway, the way those elections work is, in effect, you're running for office. First past the post. So whoever gets the most bid wins. If you get 4, I get 3, you get 2, you won with 4. And what happened is the existing Prime Minister Modi kind of got his butt kicked. I mean, he had a with his BJP party, he had an absolute majority from the vote last time. This time he lost 63 seats, so he's got 240 out of 543. With his coalition partners, he still has a majority, but it's pretty slim. And this was kind of in the face of he's going to kick butt and maybe even add to his majority, which proved wrong. So kind of the last thing I'll say on it, the big issue seemed to be unemployment of young people, because they're at a 45-year high on unemployment. And college graduates, 42% of them are unemployed. The youth unemployment in general is like 22%, kind of compared with 7% overall. So that seemed to be kind of the big beef.
Yeah, it contrasts with what we saw in the EU election, which we'll talk about here in a minute. You had the center left in India, despite really loud predictions of a landslide. In fact, there was a belief or fear that BJP was going to actually win 400 seats this time around after winning 303 in 2019. So 400 was believed to be in reach. And there were a lot of predictions of a BJP landslide, which did not occur. In fact, exit polling in this latest round, in the 7th phase, was suggesting that that landslide was going to come to pass, and it didn't. So I think above all, this proves the resilience of the India democratic system and sometimes the reliability or unreliability of polling, which obviously we've seen here in recent and past elections in the U.S.
It was crazy.
I was just talking to a friend about that with statistics and polling. I was like, it's crazy how wrong polling is.
With technology today, you've never been so able to avoid polling if you want. And so there's more selection bias in samples than ever. This is crazy. There were almost 1 billion people registered to vote. About 2/3 of those people voted. So you had north of 600 million people vote. Half the people that voted were women. So you had 300 some odd million women vote.
Wow.
I mean, almost the population of the United States.
Population of the U.S.
In terms of the size of women voting.
That's insane.
So the minority party's fear of this landslide is that there would be an increase in Hindu nationalism, which Modi has been characterized as being, somewhat of a, what do they call it, a unipolar type of approach. And so this I think tempers that fear. I didn't realize the unemployment issue that was that you just mentioned, Chuck. But it's going to be interesting to see, because as we've talked about in the recent past, India's got this balancing act between being part of the coalition of governments and countries that are pushing more toward, like the EU, pushing more toward energy transition and net zero. But we've also seen from the Indians a pretty redoubled effort to increase coal production and coal-fired generation, which up till now has constituted roughly 2/3 to 70% of India's power generation, which has an uptime, I believe, somewhere in the 50 to 60% range. So, and also I think Modi has been making, or has been giving off signals that India wants to join the IEA, which then puts them within that set of rules and guidelines. So politically, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, because BJP has been an India first. That's
because he was
central to the platform of BJP.
What's the benefit of joining the IEA, especially when your country's at 50% uptime? Like, I'd be looking at how I increase my uptime.
Well, that's the conundrum, right? Is that in reality, what we've seen where people have suffered both in terms of cost and reliability, an overly aggressive push to renewable sources, which are inherently more intermittent, problematic from that standpoint. We'll see how that balancing act and trade-off is handled by the BJP going forward, because I think we're at a bit of a crossroads, at least politically. Where do they go? And if I were betting on it, then I think we're going to see ultimately that it's not going to be tenable for India to join the IEA. Optically, maybe it makes sense, but practically on the ground, it's not going to make sense.
Well, they've always been, the line from India has always been, hey, yeah, we're happy to talk emissions per person. Anytime you in the West want to deal with that. The thing I find interesting is you read about this election and they talk about, will this hamper India's continued economic growth because he has less power? And I always find it interesting, in the United States, our periods of greatest economic growth are when we have divided government and the rules aren't changing. So it'll be interesting to watch that. The one thing I've read, Mark and I were talking about this a little earlier, and this was almost kind of offhand in the article I was reading, but there might be something in the way of environmentalist type stuff in terms of a push for more renewables, et cetera. They get bandied about, because when you have divided government and you're trying to build a coalition to vote for something, you're making trade-offs. So your defined environmentalist type votes can be bought with one thing, more renewables. And so that may get thrown into stuff. But again, it was kind of a murky sort of this may happen type thing.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been in Delhi in over 20 years, but I remember my first time walking out of the hotel at 9:30 in the morning, and it looked like nighttime. There was the smog cover was so heavy. I've never seen anything like it.
Yeah,
it is a real pollution issue.
Yeah, air quality is.
But what do you do with India's grid if you're going to transition away from coal? Stating the obvious, it's very difficult, and the cost issue, I think, continues to weigh pretty heavily. So I just think with the center stage, COP, and this stated desire perhaps to join the IEA, and this less than landslide election victory, these terms are 5 years. The next 5 years of Modi's leadership are going to be very interesting from a energy politics standpoint, is it India first, or is it more balanced relative to the other member countries of the IEA?
I looked at I just searched, what are the major issues for smog and air pollution in India? Just curious, is it all from coal or what is it? And first one was vehicle emissions. So rapidly growing population with many older vehicles running on diesel and emitting high levels of particulate matter and other pollutants. Second one, industrial emissions from industries, particularly thermal power plants burning coal. Crop residue burning. Farmers in states like, they burn rice stubble after the harvest, releasing huge amounts of particulates. That's interesting.
Biomass.
Well, if you go down the list, number 5 is residential biomass burning, the burning of solid fuels like firewood, cow dung cakes.
And as we talked about in the UK with Drax and their conversion of coal-fired generation facilities to wood pellets, although not accounted for, emit more than coal from
per joule of power, or whatever metric
from a CO2 standpoint.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So you look at that and it's like, okay. I mean, one problem is that they just have a shit ton of people, right? And growing vehicle population, and probably use a ton of,
because if
4-cycle motorbikes over there that are terrible.
I mean, if you're an 18-year-old kid and you get to borrow your dad's car and take the head cheerleader out on a date, man, you can do everything in your power to have a car for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
So that's not just an American phenomenon.
But
everybody wants a car.
Even like Juan on our team down in Guadalajara, like he's excited because he's going to get to buy a car soon. He's like, now I go to the other side of town to train jiu-jitsu. And so, but not having a car has prevented him from being able to do that. And so, but I think the residential biomass burning is interesting because you look at the whole movement in the United States against natural gas being piped into homes and the respiratory issues it causes and all this shit. Well, usually it comes down to poor ventilation and not a large enough space, if we're being completely honest. But I saw this video, I believe it was from the IEA, and I posted on Twitter several weeks back, and it was of a woman in a village in Africa. And she talks about how she spends most of her day collecting firewood to cook on. So she wakes up in the morning, walks out, collects firewood, comes and cooks, goes back out, collects more firewood for dinner, spends most of her day collecting firewood and cooking. And then they cook inside their house with this wooden fire. And so her and all of her children have respiratory issues.
Yeah, women and children who are disproportionately exposed to that poorly ventilated space while the burning is going on and have disproportionately higher health issues.
She made a comment verbatim about how much nicer life would be for them if they had natural gas. She didn't say solar
you basically
or anything else.
You double your life expectancy when you stop burning dung inside your house for heat and cooking.
Yeah. So anyways, you always have this, you have this argument from people on Twitter. It's like, oh, well, if they're going to switch, they're going to switch to lower cost energy sources, which is wind and solar. It's like, okay, well, if that's the case, then they will switch to the lowest cost source. But this whole heating and cooking issue, sure, you can make a case that, hey, electrified appliances and those are powered by solar, but it just seems very logical that nat gas and propane displace that and take away
propane and propane accessories.
I sell propane and propane accessories.
There you go. Well, onto more election news and maybe even better election news. EU, the Greens got shellacked. Bam.
Yeah, just a couple of anecdotes. The Greens did not lose their majority in the EU Parliament, but it is weaker. Some of the immediate reactions, one I found most amusing is that French President Macron immediately dissolved Parliament after a crushing loss to Marine Le Pen's far-right party. And the Social Democrats in Germany, Olaf Scholz's party, suffered their worst defeat at the hands of the Christian Democrats in more than a century. So, this type of maybe quasi-gridlock is the way to think about it, where you don't have that just steamrolling majority that existed for the last however many years in the EU Parliament. There's going to be a lot more friction related to net zero by 2050 policies and all the related programs and ultimately costs that a European citizenry and across several key countries that are clamoring. And there was a lot of wringing of hands over the populist voice being more heard in this election than ever before. Well, it's a function of what they've been on a daily basis been living through for the last several years, most notably during the recent energy crisis. So I look forward to being back in Europe here in a couple of weeks and seeing some different perspective on the ground.
I saw this post from Elon Musk on Twitter. I'm scrolling Twitter as Mark's talking. Said if we all work together, we can reach Uranus. that dude.
So let's keep it with let's keep it with. We'll hit the IEA real quick. Credit to Sean Maher, our friend, who's now the chief economist at Phillips 66, commented on the IEA's report on clean energy spending versus fossil fuel spending in 2024. Almost $2 for every dollar spent on fossil fuels is in quote unquote clean energy, as the IEA characterizes it. Of that, $2.5 trillion is in solar PV category, which is more than slightly over 400 million in all other generation categories combined.
You said there's $2 trillion in capex.
$3 trillion total, $2 trillion in clean energy.
Oh, okay. $1
trillion or so in fossil fuels. And I read a bit of the highlights of that on the IEA's report. We'll post the link to that. One of the first subtext or headlines is that there's a lamenting of the fact that emerging market and developing countries only account for 15% of the clean energy spending. And somewhat absent, at least in what I read, is what we always talk about. What about, transmission in the grid? And I thought about, some recent pieces that I've read about this accelerated build out of solar and wind in the U.S., it's showing up in the rate base. So you put shorter lived, new capital assets in the rate base, and the utilities are guaranteed a rate of return. So you've got a larger number asset base. And so that inherently translates into higher power costs. So if we're going to accelerate this, what does that mean in terms of how those costs are borne, or do the rules change ultimately where we have a different, more competitive way? Because the incentive to accelerate spending adds high depreciation assets, new assets. Plus, if you look at the life cycle of what's ostensibly replacing on the generation side, baseload, which it's really not, unless we get grid scale battery storage across the board. What does that mean for these states and for the PUCs that are having to make these decisions on what type of generation to add and how fast? I saw something last week, I don't remember the source, that there's a resurgence in build out of gas-fired generation in Texas, which I think has a lot of connection to.
We're putting together
anticipated power demand for data centers, et cetera. So
yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, no, it was interesting. Last week's podcast that I dropped, I had the head of AI, former head of data centers for Intel on. And the thing that I keep harping on on all this stuff is I just don't think the existing utility players are going to supply the future electricity we're going to need. I mean, they're just monopolies, monopolistic mindset. To your point, we start sticking in renewables and things that lead to higher rates and having to build transmission. And that's just really, really complicated. And they've gotten us this far. So kudos to them. I don't think they're going to do it going forward. I think you're gonna start for these data centers making decisions on for your data center. How am I going to power this? And tech is all just focused on nukes. And energy guys go, well, there's a lot of regulatory stuff you got to go through to do nukes. And I go, not if you're a tech company. If you're an energy company, yeah, they hate us.
I was talking to Founders Fund last week, and guy was like, man, I'm super bullish on energy demand. He's like, specifically nat gas, power up data centers. So now with that said, Founders Fund is an outlier in the way that they think from Silicon Valley.
Well, and I thought
that was cool as shit to hear from him. I mean, he didn't bring up nukes. I mean, he went straight to nat gas.
Yeah. Cause my thing to all the natty companies, I've been tweeting it out. I gave a speech about it, is like, start calling on big tech. You know, you're ahead. Be the crack dealer. Give away the crack.
I mean, this has always been the way that's going, is colocation.
Well, we did have the energy secretary recently at Vogel commissioning or ribbon cutting say we're going to embark upon a massive build out of nukes. But as we talked about with Bob Kuntz a few weeks ago, something's got to change in terms of the crushing regulatory burden and costs that are foisted upon nuclear developers, both large and small. And, that takes a lot of time. And if you look back to that graph of the build out of nuclear by country, the U.S. has a big hockey stick in the late 70s, early 80s. The French have proven pretty adept at building grid scale nuclear generation and doing it very cost effectively. So
I think what changes though is, as Chuck talks about a lot, Silicon Valley has a lot of political clout. So you have that going. But then too, with the small modular reactors, it sounds like there's a lot less regulatory.
And plus they collaborate. So, I mean, Google and Microsoft and Amazon will all get together and say, hey, let's choose one design for these reactors. We need it about this side, boom, 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 then put their might behind it and go.
And that's where the political leverage and changing the whole regulatory overburden and framework is going to be driven. Yeah. It's going to be through big tech.
So you've seen some pretty cool. I just recorded a podcast with Mike Umbro last week on oil and gas startups. It hasn't released yet, but once it releases, everyone should go listen to it because it's really good. We talked all about geothermal energy storage and what his whole play is. But I look at essentially what Mike and his guys are doing is they get these massive cylinder solar arrays, and they capture thermal heat from the sun, and then they generate steam, and then they pump that down hole and they heat up the reservoir. And so it's kind of like artificial geothermal. It's super fucking cool stuff. And then there's another startup that just got funded by Sam Altman and some other investors. And it's a built for purpose data center energy technology. And so essentially they have these big shipping containers where your data centers are in, and then they have these solar panels, but they're not using solar panels for power generation. They're capturing the heat, and then they use that heat to power a steam turbine, and then they've got batteries. So it provides this 24/7 baseload power that's right there on the containers themselves. And so this whole idea of using solar as a heat source to power engines is pretty cool. So you're starting to see some things like that are kind of purpose built for data centers. But it doesn't matter if it's nuclear, if it's solar thermal heat, if it's nat gas. You're going to need it all, and it's going to be co-located. And this isn't just with data centers. This is going to be big manufacturing operations. Like manufacturing facilities draw a ton of power themselves, and I think you'll start seeing them being closer located to their primary energy source.
And my whole point is you, the producer of natural gas, recognize who your ultimate customer is and go straight to them.
Yeah.
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 Like how do we solve all this? Because you get, you sit around and hope that the utility is going to do it for you, and they don't, then we're in trouble.
Yeah,
so,
I agree with that.
So that's one thing. The other thing that Zane Ball said, the Intel guy, that was really fascinating was, he's like, man, we're in the second inning of designing data centers. He goes, man, we start throwing a lot of brain power at that. We can get super entrepreneurial, super creative, super more energy efficient. He goes, we've really only been doing this 10 years. Now imagine if we turn AI onto how do we make these more efficient? He goes, he's like, I think we're second and third inning of that stuff.
We had a really interesting conversation last week or the week before with Rob Stewart from Lime Instruments, and Rob's family's really storied. They were Stewart and Stevenson, and he's super fucking smart when it comes to the engineering side of power generation and turbines. And so he was schooling me up. And one thing that he brought up that I haven't even been thinking about in this idea of power generation out on oil and gas assets is, not only just having a nat gas turbine allow you to get cheaper electricity for all of your assets than pulling from the grid, but you get a higher quality of power as well. And he just started diving down into how important the quality of that power is, and for keeping ESPs alive and all of these different systems. And so if you look at, the future opportunity for E&Ps or midstreams, it's, hey, start generating your own power. You don't have to sell to a peaker plant anymore or to a refinery. You produce power right there. And then with that electron, you power up your own assets, get higher quality of power. You can participate in ERCOT's ancillary program if you're in Texas, put it into the grid during peak demand, or you take all those electrons and you host data centers, high performance computing,
Bitcoin mine, everything.
Bitcoin mining.
Yeah. So it's just a very interesting time. And
I've actually heard two of our more entrepreneurial private E&P companies have hired ex-IPP guys to come in and say, hey, how do I address this? Mm-hmm. So, anytime the private E&P rich guys start looking at stuff, there's probably some merit to it.
Your mantra is taking shape.
Yeah, there we go.
Get out of the producing and selling natural gas business into
selling
generating
electrons.
And selling electrons.
Exactly.
So let's go real quick to transportation. We'll talk about trains this week and planes and automobiles next week. Former colleague and a really good friend, Ryan Zorn, who has recently joined Liberty as their director of energy additions. He's been pretty heavily involved with things like their sustainability reporting, but now he's on Chris's team. Posted an analysis in an op-ed. I call it a fact ed because it's filled with facts, as Ryan tends to do.
As opposed to opinions.
And so the Denver Gazette reached out to Ryan and said, hey, would you expand this, edit it and expand it to include the Denver rail system in the analysis? Basically what its focus is to essentially cost out what the emissions avoidance of rail. So in Colorado, you now have a $58 million a year add to rental car fees, so $3 per rental. And then you've added $175 million in what he called a ransom in a new oil and gas production fee in support of Governor Police's and the Colorado administration's and politicians' vision of a rail build out. So the cost for Rail Denver RTD, I'm not sure exactly what the acronym stands for. I should have looked that up. is $2.88 per passenger mile. That's 5 times more than the allowable IRS deductible for your car for business use. They recently had a program called Zero Fare for Better Air on RTD. So you ride free and avoid your own carbon emissions. And that only raised demand 10%. The equivalent price of carbon avoidance, or the carbon price, would be $5,600 a ton. Now you compare that to California's 2023 cap and trade price of $30 a ton. The original article that he wrote, because he lives in the Winter Park, Fraser area, was about the ski train that Amtrak runs during the ski season. And he did a comparison for a family of 4 driving versus riding the ski train. Well, it's $144 premium per family to ride the ski train versus driving. That includes parking, that includes cost of fuel, which is pretty representative. And so the indifference point for gasoline to overcome this $144 premium is $30.52 a gallon, according to his calculations. And the emissions mitigation cost for that ride versus drive is $52,000 a ton. Americans on average emit about 19 tons a year per person. So these are less than drops in the ocean in terms of mitigation at unsustainable costs. Ultimately, somebody's paying for it. You know, back to Denver's rail system, I believe it's either 5 or 10%. Passenger fares only cover 5 to 10% of Rail Denver's operating costs.
Yeah, that's consistent with the numbers I've heard about Houston.
Yeah, it's not all that different. I just thought it was an interesting highlight of, you know,
they
certainly
cover fares only cover 5 to 10%.
5 to 10% of the operating costs.
Yeah, like, and that's not even getting your money back for building the system. That's just the operating cost.
Yeah.
So the Denver Gazette piece is not behind a paywall. It's worth reading. It's a good analysis, supported by a lot of fact. That's why I like to call it a fact-ed piece, not an op-ed piece.
Fact-ed.
That's interesting. I like riding the train from Denver Airport into downtown, so it's good public utility. But yeah, they used to charge like $1, so it makes sense that it doesn't make any money.
Oh, and back to the Amtrak ski train with kind of the peak numbers during ski season. The capacity of the train or the ridership is 1% of the total.
Yeah.
So it's not a large scale scalable solution.
Yeah.
Cool.
And if you move out coal, apparently there's some, kind of economic viability of the track itself. And so the infrastructure is supporting strictly passenger operations, and there's talk of an extension to steamboat, et cetera. You put more burden on taxpayers and get less utility, economic utility out of it. So interesting read. I'd recommend everybody take a look at that.
Cool. We'll link to that. All right, gents, coming up on the end of the show, we got anything? We stopped, I realized we stopped doing our finger of the week a long time ago.
Yeah. I kind of miss finger of the week. That video was fun.
We'll have to, someone really deserves a finger. We'll bring it back.
The one thing we do need to give a shout out to is June 6th and D-Day, launching the invasion into Normandy to take Europe back from the Nazis. I saw Biden's speech. I'll give Biden credit. That was a good speech he gave, and just seeing the cemetery and seeing, there were 150 veterans up there, and they were ages, 98 to 104, because this was the 80th anniversary of it. And when I took my girls a couple of years ago to Paris, I made them go spend one day up in Normandy, and I actually shot this on the podcast. I did a Texan Looks at Paris. The thing that struck me about Normandy, which was so amazing, is they were sending over 3 waves of ship. And the first wave were a bunch of privates, secure the beach. Then the second wave was going to bring, colonels, those type folks. And then the third wave was going to bring the generals to a T, to a letter. All the U.S. generals went with the first wave, including Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the
Who
president.
was 57.
57, walking with a cane. And somebody tried to say, no, you're on the third ship. And he hit him with the cane to get out of my fucking way. But what happened on that first wave coming in, there was actually a lot more wind and blew several ships to the west, including the one Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was on. And him being there, he made the call of, hey, we start the war right here, land it. A bunch of privates would have freaked out, not had what to do. And that was instrumental in D-Day being successful. And so it's pretty powerful stuff this weekend watching, and we should all be grateful.
Yeah, I make a habit every June 6th of watching Reagan's 1984 speech went to the Rangers, the Ranger veterans. I think it's certainly was the greatest presidential speech of his term. I think it's one of the greatest of all time. And that's
Obama gave a great one too. Obama had a line of, so much of the course of human events were dictated by literally a fight for a stretch of beach 2 miles wide and
Did you see the 97-year-old paratrooper who actually made a jump?
Yeah,
it was a tandem jump. It was really cool, and his guide basically rolled on top of him when they landed, and he looks up and he said, "I'm okay. I'm okay."
My great uncle Johnny was in the 101st. He jumped, and he's no longer with us, but when I knew him, I was a younger kid, and he was a small, old, frail man, just nice as could be. And he'd tell us stories about, jumping and getting lost and having to find team members. And they go and kill a couple Nazis and take their uniforms and go to their camp and get in the chow line to get some food and then blow up a bridge on their way out. And as a kid, like, you don't appreciate those stories. Now looking back on it, I'm like, dude, this guy was a bad motherfucker.
Yeah.
He's 17 years old when he went into the military. And
so many of those guys sitting on the stage that were in their 90s were there because they lied about their age to go to war.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. They were children. They were kids, and it's just crazy because you sit there like as a kid, like you're not even in a place of consciousness to fathom what they went through.
Save the planet.
And he would never, they would never put that on either, right? Like I think this was what's crazy about that generation. Like there's this podcast, I don't know if I'll have time to get the link, but everyone should go listen to it. It's a podcast from Jocko. It's the only podcast I've ever listened to in my life from Jocko. And it's like 2.5 hours long. And it's talking about the story of a guy from Louisiana. And what's forgetting the name, but he was held prisoner of war in the Philippines, and they got put on a trail, and they had a march.
Ho Chi Minh Trail.
No, that wasn't it.
It was Bataan Death March.
Yes, that was it. Yes, thank you, Mark. Anyways, just horrific. Most of the U.S. troops died, and he survived, and he went on to be a geologist in oil and gas. And it was like this dude went through the most just unimaginable pain and torture, and lost his 2 brothers in the war, and just went on to live a normal life somehow after that. But seriously, like, I'm not an emotional guy, and every time I listen to this podcast, probably once a year, just to get a dose of reality and perception. And at the end of it, every single fucking time, I start tearing up, and it's that sad. But guy went on to be a rock licker and in oil and gas.
So Veritan did release a COBT special edition on Thursday at 6:30. They had Alex Kershaw, who wrote a recent book. He's spent his whole life on World War II, and a heavy portion of that on D-Day. He's a Brit, has lived in the U.S. for a number of decades, but a lot of the first wave detail that's in that discussion is pretty interesting, and it's, I think, only an hour long. So the thing that was really compelling to me was the gliders that came into the key bridge called Pegasus Bridge, and they basically had to crash land these wooden gliders and immediately take over a bridge. And, you know, I think they said they impacted at something over 100 miles an hour. So there's a lot of people mangled and killed in those gliders as well, which was just courage unimaginable.
It's different times.
You go today, go out to Normandy, you go walk around, you got to go see the American Cemetery. It's amazing. But I mean, the bunkers are still there. Mm-hmm. The Germans were sitting in.
So the pockmarks.
Yeah. Well, good shout out, Chuck. All right. We got to wrap this up, but quick notes. We have Energy Tech Night in Oklahoma City this Thursday. So if you're in OKC, come hang out with us. It's a good time. I don't know off the top of my head what startups we have presenting, but will be a good show regardless. OKC was a good time last year. So make sure to check that out. You can get tickets on digitalwildcatters.com. Best $50 you ever spent. You get free beer, pizza, good company. So see you there, and we will catch y'all on next week's episode.